Good evening, everyone. While we wait, can everyone just test and try to mute and unmute themselves on their own? Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're just missing Carol. We can get started, and we will just begin in 1 minute, and we'll just if she joins late, she joins late. Okay, we will get started, and Carol would join. I'm not hearing back, so I know there was an issue at work. So I will call to order the December 15th special virtual council meeting, and we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you can stand, please do. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I look forward to saying that with you all in person sometime soon. Roll call, Ms. LeBreau.
Okay, Ms. Blanks will be joining us momentarily. Ms.
Yes.
Cantor?
Yes, here.
Mr. Davidoff?
Here.
Ms. Fay?
Present.
Mr. Gold?
Here.
Ms. Kerrigan? Ms. Kerrigan? Mr. Sweeney?
Here.
Here.
Mr. Wen. Okay, thank you. That's Ms. Kerrigan. And Mr. Winograd?
Here.
And Mr. Williams. I saw Mr. Williams.
Here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. LeBrow. Appreciate it. We will now go to our next agenda item, which is a pension obligation bonds, and I will kick this over to Mr. Hart.
Thank you, Mayor. Matt Hart, Town Manager. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at tonight's meeting. I will now ask Ms. Reinheimer to load the presentation, if she could. Thank you, Jerida. And if you could proceed to the next slide. All right. So this evening, Council, we're going to be presenting you with a very, very important, very significant recommendation. This is following up on individual conversations we've had with several of you. As you know, we've got a very talented group that's been working on this initiative, led by Peter Privatera, our Director of Finance, Becky Seelman, our Consulting Actuary, Bill Lindsay, our Financial Advisor, Matt Ritter, our Bond Counsel, also joined this evening by Bruce Chudwick, also our Bond Counsel, and Chris, last but certainly not least, Chris Kashmar, our Investment Advisor. And Council will recall, we've been looking at the question of whether or not it would make sense for the town to issue pension obligation bonds for some time now, for 2 to 3 years, and really want to credit the mayor again for bringing this idea forward a couple years back. And we actually conducted a similar presentation with the previous town council. Many of you veterans will recall that. And at that point in time, it just didn't make sense to proceed. But the environment has changed, and we think it does make sense to proceed now. Ms. Reinheimer, if you could advance to the next slide, please. So I'm going to turn things over through you, Mayor, to Mr. Privatera in a moment, but I just want to touch on a couple of points here. You know, why are we recommending this? Why are Peter and I and other members of the team recommending this to you? You know, very, very significant decision. We get all that. Number one, we think that this issuing the pension obligation bonds, or POBs for short, it really would allow us to fund our pension obligation, you know, which increases over time at a lower annual cost than funding the actuarial determined employer contribution, the ADEC, and the process we've been using for the past decades now. And this would allow us to fully fund our pension plan, which has been roughly 42% for some years now, in that range. We'd be able to fully fund the pension plan and be able to provide tax relief to our residents and other taxpayers, because we think we could achieve some significant savings here. Another distinction at this point in time, which we did not have when we looked at this 2 to 3 years ago, we have historically low interest rates. You know, they may not be there forever, but they're there now. And it makes sense to take advantage of that opportunity. The third point I wanted to touch on, and Peter will elaborate on all of these. We are, as part of this recommendation, we would recommend to you that we establish a pension reserve fund, utilizing the first year's contribution to our ADEC. We would instead create a pension bond reserve fund, and that would give us a very important buffer, a very important source of funds that we could draw upon to mitigate significant increases during the lifetime of the bond repayment schedule. So if any given year, if it's 5 years, 10 years down the line, if we're looking at a significant increase in that year, we can draw upon this reserve fund in order to prevent against a spike in our debt service costs. And then the fourth point, and we did not do this, at least not in such a complete fashion or in such a robust fashion when we looked at this 2 to 3 years ago. Ms. Seelman has conducted a very sophisticated model, the stochastic model is the official term for it, looking at 10,000 different scenarios. And the results are quite favorable, we think, and show a very high probability that our recommendations would prove successful. So those are the introductory comments I wanted to make. I did want to thank again the members of the team. They've been working long and hard on this for several months now to bring this proposal to you for your consideration. So through you, Madam Mayor, I'd like to call on Mr. Privatera.
Thank you, Mr. Hart, and we'll go to Mr. Privatera. I also want to thank all of the people that have contributed to this. This has, again, been a lot of work. Now over to you, Mr. Privatera. Don't forget to state your name and your title. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Peter Privatera, Director of Financial Services. Next slide, please, Loretta. So pension obligation bonds, when people talk about pension obligation bonds, there's usually some sort of negative connotation with that. When we look at pension obligation bonds, why don't they work for some communities? And usually it's because communities that have issued them in the past have been distressed communities with cash flow issues, limited financial flexibility. They've had to issue them when market conditions were not favorable. They issued them with a very aggressive asset growth assumption, and they were issued with no backup plan to mitigate increases in pension contributions during economic downturns. They had nowhere to turn, and historically, in the past, they were issued without any stochastic analysis. So, what makes us different? Well, West Hartford is a financially sound AAA rated community by Moody's and S&P. It's a very unique opportunity for us to take advantage of historically low bond interest rates. The analysis that we performed is based on a realistic asset growth assumption, which we all agreed on. And the creation of the pension bond reserve fund is unique because it's like having an insurance policy that if we run into a tough times and there's significant economic downturn, we can mitigate the year-over-year increase in the actuarially determined employer contribution by dipping into the reserve fund. Now, with that, the team and we have created a reserve fund policy that we would submit to the council for review and adoption or any amendments to it. So we do have a plan in place on how to manage that policy as well. And as the town manager said, Becky Seelman and her team went through a rigorous stochastic analysis of 10,000 scenarios just to make sure that the full range of possible risks over the lifetime of the bonds, which is 25 years, would be measured. And I think that that's very favorable. And I think that the analysis proved to be very telling. Next slide, please. I think we need to talk about the history and the current status of the pension fund before we get into the pension obligation bonds. The accrued liability as of July 1st, 2020 is $531 million. And you can see on the left-hand slide, the table, the chart there, you can see that the significant portion of that, or 344 million of that, is for service retirees. And 156.3 million is for active members who are actively pursuing a retirement benefit when they finish their employment. Now, if you look at the right-hand column, the accrued liability, it's been growing year over year. Now, there are a couple of reasons why. Number one is we've been slowly reducing the discount rate or the asset growth rate every year to try to get closer to a realistic number. And when we do that, it basically increases the liability, because if we're assuming we're only going to earn 6.99% instead of 7.5%, obviously, that's going to reduce our projected growth. And we've done that on a measured basis. We've gradually reduced the discount rate to be more realistic with the rates, but we've done it because we've done it on a gradual basis because we've also did not want to create an additional significant tax burden for the taxpayers of West Hartford. So it was done on a very responsible basis. And we've also had to implement new mortality tables. Matter of fact, a significant change came last year, and we're basically phasing that in over a 2-year period. But if you look at the column of 2019, that's the actuarial date. That reflects our current fiscal year. So in the current fiscal year, our accrued liability is $510.8 million. Next fiscal year, measured as of July of 2020, it's going to jump up to $531 million, which again is a $20 million increase. Now, you know, I've basically talked to many of you about this, and I just want to reiterate this before I move on to the next slide. When I first started working for the town about 8 years ago, the pension fund was funded at 45%. And every year, we have made all the correct decisions. I give credit to the pension board and the town council for making all the changes, all the necessary and responsible changes that needed to be made. And every year, the pension board will recommend a discount rate and a contribution, and every year, the town council would accept that and move on. But over the last 8 years, we've seen the funded ratio drop from 45% to, I believe, 40.6% is projected for next fiscal year. So we've done everything we needed to do, but for all intents and purposes, we're running in place because the liabilities have been increasing and the funded ratios have been decreasing. Next slide, please.
Peter, before you go, I just want to recognize that Carol is here. She joined, I think, a couple slides ago. So just for the record, Carol Blanks is also on this, is present. Thank you. Carol, do you need to get Carol's?
Need me to say present?
Yeah,
I saw her attend. Yes, thank you.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Peter. Back to you.
Okay, it's okay. Thank you. This slide identifies that on the left-hand portion of the slide, you can see that there always is year-to-year asset volatility, you know, measured both on a market value of assets basis and an actuarial value of assets basis. And on the right hand of the slide, you can plainly see that as of July 1st of 2020, the accrued liability was measured at $531 million, which is roughly a $20 million increase. The actuarial value of assets is $215 million. Last year, or the current year, I think that was about $209 million. And the unfunded accrued liability grew from roughly $302 million to $315 million, which dropped the funded ratio from, I believe, 40.9% to 40.6%. Next slide, please. So when we look at this slide, on the left-hand side, we can see, again, that the unfunded liability is increases on a year-to-year basis. Now, again, it's increasing at the same time we are making all the correct decisions, the best decisions that we can make while being fiscally responsible. And on the right side of this slide, you can see that the funded ratio over the past 5 years, in 2016, the actuarial year was 43.3%, and now we're projecting 40.6% next year. So basically, our unfunded accrued liability is growing while our funded ratio is dropping. And the funded ratio is one of the metrics that the rating agencies use to gauge the health of the pension fund. And, it gives us great concern because we are a AAA rated community, but we only have roughly a 40% funded ratio. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at this is our annual contribution every year. Now, you can see that we've increased every year. If you look at fiscal year 21, the increase doesn't look as significant only because the new mortality tables came out that year. And in order to mitigate a significant increase, I talked with the actuaries and we phased that in over a 2-year period. So you can see the jump in 21-22, which is next fiscal year, the jump is a little under 1.5 million, but 73% of that liability is a past service cost that's allocated against the unfunded accrued liability, which is significant. So with the pension fund reserve, with the pension bond reserve fund, if we are successful with this, that 26.9 million, rather than going into the pension fund, would go into the reserve fund, and that would be the money we would use to mitigate any year-to-year spikes due to economic downturns with our annual pension contribution. Next slide, please. Now, looking in the future, if we didn't do anything, if every year we assumed, with the exception of next year, every year after that we assumed a 6.25% interest rate or asset growth rate, and every year we were fortunate enough to get a 6.25% return on our investment, and nothing else changed, in 20 years, our funded ratio would grow from 40.6 to 77%. But on the right-hand graphic, you can see that the annual contribution continues to rise and rise and rise from 26 to 29 to 33 to 37 to 40, almost $42 million. So there is a consequence associated with that. And again, we're hoping that by issuing pension obligation bonds, we can fully fund the liability, but flatten that curve as well. Next slide, please. Okay, now I just want to talk about the bonds themselves. Rather than me just reading this off verbatim, a pension obligation bond, it's a general obligation bond. The only difference is that it's taxable. When we issue debt every year, we issue non-taxable bonds for all of our capital improvements. A pension obligation bond is a taxable bond, and because it's taxable, we can invest it, and which is what we would do with the pension fund. And there is a slightly higher interest rate associated with taxable bonds, roughly 75 to 100 basis points higher than tax-exempt bonds. But in this very low interest rate environment, it's a very favorable transaction. Just to remind you that recently we refunded tax-exempt bonds with taxable bonds, and we're able to save almost $1 million over a 2-year period. So the interest rate environment is very favorable. Next slide, please. So again, the purpose of pension obligation bonds. We sell the bonds at a low interest rate. We deposit them into the pension fund with higher yielding asset classes. The variance, as referred to as arbitrage, is basically the money that we would make in the transaction, which would lower our contribution on an annual basis. So that's the theory behind this. We're substituting a higher liability with a lower liability. Next slide, please. So what are we funding here? We're funding the unfunded accrued liability portion of the total accrued liability. If you recall, I mentioned the unfunded liability as measured in July of 2020 was roughly $315 million. Now, we would issue bonds for a greater amount than that because we would have to pay the interest on the bonds and also the cost of issuing the bonds. But it's only to fund the unfunded accrued liability. Next slide. So these are our primary areas of consideration: the legal implications, short and long-term market conditions, credit rating implications, and proposed financial outcome. Next slide. I want to turn it over now to Matt Ritter, who's our bond counsel, and I want to say that everyone on this team, we have worked together for many, many, many years, and they're all very knowledgeable of the town, its requirements, everything we needed to do to put this thing together. I had a lot of confidence in these folks because they knew exactly what the town was looking for and what we needed to do. So I'm glad they're all part of this team. So Matt, I want to turn it over to you now.
It's going to go through me, but thank you, Mr. Privatera.
Sorry.
That's okay. Attorney Ritter, now it's over to you. Just remember to state your name and title for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Matt Ritter from Shipman and Goodwin, and we serve as bond counsel to the town. And thank you, Pete, for that nice introduction, and hope everybody's doing well tonight. Actually, you can go to the next slide. I've read the title there. So I think Pete sort of mentioned this, right? And I think our part is in many ways sort of first talking about why does the state of Connecticut play a role in the issuance of pension obligation bonds, right? Why is this unique? Because as Pete said, you guys right now, you have your town charter. You issue bonds all the time for capital projects. You pave your sidewalks. You've refunded bonds. You've done all those things without state involvement. And Pete touched on it on the first slide. It is unique for a AAA rated community to look at this and look at this option. There's not been, there's probably been 5 or 10 towns that I can think of that have done this. And Pete's right. They tended to be a little more distressed. Their assumptions are much higher. There was not an establishment of reserve fund. And so what happened back in the 90s, I believe, and Bruce Chowick, my partner's on as well, and he worked on some of these original transactions, is the state treasurer and OPM said, we want to be involved in this. We want to get information from the town. We believe ultimately the state has a concern and wants to have input with local officials about issuing pension obligation bonds. Because as Pete said, you really are playing an arbitrage game. But I think we'll talk about the reserve fund in a second, but that's a really unique component to this transaction that I haven't seen in others. I'm not going to read to you all of this stuff, but you can see it comes right out of the statute, 7-374C. And these are the initial documents that OPM is going to ask for in the state treasurer's office will ask for from the town. It's a lot of documentation, and they have the right to review it, provide comment, ask questions, ask for additional information. They do not have the right to say no. They cannot reject the town's ability to issue these pension obligation bonds. But obviously their comments, their feedback, their public statements are all going to play a role, and the town's going to want to work well with them. A couple of things I'd point out in this, what I call initial submission to the state, okay? One of the things they're going to want to see is a bond ordinance, which you have not adopted yet. Obviously, depending on the council and what you all want to do, that's something we'd have to adopt at some point. I believe, Pete, a draft of that went around. I think, yep. And so I'm glad to answer any questions on the bond ordinance itself. And that would be one of the first things they're going to need to see. The second thing is, in that bond ordinance, there's something unique, and looks like it is number, where is it? Well, I can't find the exact number it is on this list here, but they also want to know that in a bond ordinance, the town has agreed to appropriate the ADEC on an annual basis, right? One of the biggest concerns the state would have is you issue these pension obligation bonds, everything's going well, you have a nice rate of return for a couple years on what's to be a 25 or 30-year term of bonds. Then you stop paying the ADEC. You stop paying your actuarially required contribution, and you're right back where you started. So one of the protections in place the state put in, again, they can't tell you can't do it, but they can require you, they do require you by state law to make that annual payment until all of the bonds are paid off and no longer outstanding. That's important because obviously the ability to shortchange the pension fund, even in good years, could have long-term implications. The statute also allows the town to go up to a maximum of 30 years. Pete, I believe the number runs you've done are 25. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And again, it's another indication of the town looking very carefully at if you go 30 years, you'll pay less on an annual basis, but you'll pay more in debt service over the long run. Again, not cutting corners, being very cautious and considerate in this approach. I do want to talk quickly about the reserve fund because one of the things in that first slide, we talked about municipalities that have done this in the past. Not only did they potentially have a higher rate of return than was realistic over a 25 or 30-year basis, a lot of them take that first year savings, right? Because when you issue these bonds, as Pete said, you're going to deposit all of the proceeds into your pension fund, right? The year that you do that, which will probably be fiscal year, I believe it'll be 21, 22, Pete, correct?
Yes, it'll be 20. I'm sorry, Madam Mayor, through you.
Oh, sorry, Mayor. I'm sorry, Mayor. I'm violating protocol myself. My apologies.
I'm going to start getting nasty texts from our corporation counsel soon. So, okay.
Through you, Madam Mayor.
Yes, Pete Privatero, Finance Director. Yes, we would sell the bonds. I believe in the summer we would deposit them in the pension fund. And again, the ADEC that we would budget for next fiscal year would be deposited in the reserve fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. And thank you, Madam Mayor. And the reason that's important is the town's not taking those savings and just using it to reduce the mill rate or using it to plug a general fund deficit. The town is intentionally taking what could otherwise be significant one-year revenue and putting it in this reserve fund. There have been reserve funds created, but I don't think to this level. And I think that shows a further commitment of the town to doing something that's different and conservative. The last thing I want to touch on was that reserve fund policy that Pete mentioned. I'm glad to answer any questions. That is there's a lot in that document. It's only about a page and a half, but admittedly, that's a very important policy that you're going to adopt, because if the reserve fund could simply be used or rated regardless of sort of pension fund considerations, I'm not sure it would matter a heck of a lot to the council, frankly, to the bondholders and to the markets. So we did spend some time trying to think of ways to make sure the reserve fund is only used when really necessary to offset major increases. And you'll see how we sort of work through it. So I'm glad to answer any questions on that. And again, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney Ritter. Back to you, Mr. Privatera. I think there's some more slide. I don't know if you want to continue.
Yes.
I think,
Yes.
Mr. Privatera, back to you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Pete Privatera, Finance Director. To Matt's point, we did create a reserve policy, and we do have a complete version of the bond ordinance. I do not know if that was forwarded to council as of yet. I don't think it was, but I would have to defer to the town manager. But it is complete. We've talked about it. Everyone had their input on it with respect to the team, and we think it's a completed document. And if a decision is made to move forward on this, then we would forward that to the council along with the bond ordinance at the next council meeting. And with that, Urita, can you, next slide. I'd like to, through you, Madam Mayor, I'd like to turn this over now to Chris Cashmere, our pension investment advisor.
Thank you, Mr. Privatera. Mr. Cashmere, over to you.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the Town Council. Trust you're well. And just following on the heels of Matt, Peter, and Matt's comments, Chris Cashmere, DeMayo Schneider and Associates, pension and investment advisor to the pension board in town, as Peter mentioned, for many years running now. So I know some facts and figures have been thrown at you, and we just, in the interest of being topical, thought we'd share a couple of other data points and just the general philosophy on how we work with the pension board in terms of how would we structure and build a program once the proceeds have been received, should you move forward with an issuance. Just a couple of data points here listed, you'll see on the page. About 200 on a market value basis, about $245 million of pension assets at the end of November. They are invested in an allocation strategy that we regularly revisit with the pension board year to year and as circumstances dictate. Today, that strategy, as you see, is about 2/3 in global equities, about 30% in fixed income securities, and then a small sliver in real estate for diversification purposes. I would remind the town council that the program that we build and work with on the pension board is one that is exceedingly thoughtful, trumpets the virtues, I should say, of diversification at the asset class level, at the manager level, is conscious of fees, and the pension board has always been very good and disciplined about standing away from some of the noise that we invariably see in the markets week to week, month to month, even quarter to quarter, and understanding that this is a long-term gain, and that over time the benefits of diversification and being consistently invested in the markets should move the whole effort along. So to that end, you'll see there for the 10-year period ending in November, the pension portfolio has generated an annualized return of just shy of 10%. about 9.6%. As Peter mentioned, we're targeting a much lower rate than that on a go-forward basis, and we can give you some of the reasons why momentarily. One of it's just an element of conservatism, but it's also a byproduct of just the investing environment that we find ourselves confronted by right now. And it has certainly been an interesting time, as you all well know, in terms of capital market activity in calendar year 2020. Certainly things got off to a very volatile start and kind of most pronounced in the month of March, as you all know, when the markets really seized up and things came to an almost complete halt. And then on the heels of what was in essence a manufactured recession globally by virtue of all the economic shutdowns and whatnot, we had a pretty deep dive, as you all know, in returns across markets. But the markets have proven to be largely resilient since then, and we've had lots of stimulus, both in monetary and fiscal forms, and pledges to do more on those fronts, and certainly more recently some encouraging developments on the vaccination front. So we kind of enter this 2021 year, cautiously optimistic about the prospects for markets. But we do that, as I mentioned, in somewhat of a cautious fashion. And again, we'll come full circle on that thought momentarily. So what we'll do, working alongside Becky and Matt and Bill and Peter, of course, is we've developed independently capital market assumptions and inputs. And we will test those and run different permutations and combinations of assets through that optimization framework and build out a desired portfolio and what should that ultimate asset allocation look like on a go-forward basis to give the trust the best chance of meeting its annualized return objective. And I can assure you that is a fairly deep dive with more numbers and combinations and information than you'd likely care to hear about, certainly this evening. But it is a very thorough effort, and it's one that we devote a lot of resources to internally to make sure that we're being accurate and thoughtful in those efforts. We have had, no doubt, right, modifying expectations for capital market returns, and Peter foreshadowed this a bit just in terms of year over year, the pressures I know that you're all familiar with that the pension board here in town and really across the state has been dealing with, and that's indications from us and actuaries and others that expectations are more muted going forward, and legacy expectations in terms of return possibilities need to be lower on a go forward basis. And we frankly share that sentiment, and it does drive us to these lower expected returns going forward. So we'll use our own internal proprietary methodologies to build out these portfolios and to run these asset allocation exercises. We build those independently and using our own analyses, but we certainly do test those across industry norms and make sure that we're being consistent and not untoward with those expectations. And then we will build out a program and share it with the pension board of what do we actually do with those proceeds, again, when the monies are received. What is the combination of assets that's most appropriate? What is the appropriate diversification strategy at the manager level? How do we mix and match individual managers that offer complementary styles and competencies? Do we use some indexing in certain asset classes to engender fee economies? Are we active elsewhere? So those are all things that we will build out, all with the ultimate design, of course, of having a program on a go-forward basis that we think gives the trust a very reasonable chance of meeting that 6.25% annualized return hurdle. So with that, I'll pause and certainly entertain questions, Madam Mayor, or refrain later in the presentation.
I think we'll wait until the end. Thank you, Mr. Kashmar, and we'll go back through Mr. Privatera, but I think you have another member of the team that's going to, and then we'll have some questions. Thank you so much. You might be on mute, Peter. You might be on mute.
My apologies. Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to turn it over to Bill Lindsay, our our financial advisor. Bill is our direct conduit to the rating agencies, and we've had many conversations with respect to the rating implications of moving forward with this. So I'm sure Bill is going to have a lot to say. So you're right. If you can advance the slide to the next one. There we go. Thank you. I'd like to turn it over to Bill now, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Privateer. Over to you. Bill, go ahead. Thank you. Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and good evening, councilors. My name is Bill Lindsay, and I represent the firm Hilltop Securities, and I am the town's financial advisor for debt issuance. And I'm going to speak to you tonight on the credit implications of issuing pension bonds. So first, from a general sense, the issuance of pension bonds, historically are either neutral or negative to an issuer's credit rating. They're rarely positive. And we'll talk about the reasons why in a moment. The degree of the impact on the issuer's rating will really depend on a number of factors. So first and foremost, the size of the issuance, the level of the issuer's prior debt load, the rationale for issuance. Is it the goal of capturing short-term savings by maybe not making a pension contribution, or is it more about shoring up the long-term health of the pension plan? And then potentially the level of savings that is being targeted and may ultimately be achieved will factor into that consideration as well. Issuance of pension bonds, it changes the nature of the liability. We refer to it as hardening the liability. So those pension contributions that we've talked about, for some issuers, and this has not been the town's practice, but they, in times of fiscal stress, could take a holiday on making that pension contribution. But by issuing pension bonds and replacing that liability, the pension liability with a bond payment, we're really hardening that liability. And that does create additional risks on an issuer. So we listed those three categories here, the first of which is budgetary risk. And that's related to potential future savings in annual contributions that may not come to pass. Second type of risk would be default risk. Again, we're issuing the pension bonds for the purpose of funding the pension plan, and now the town is obligated to repay that loan and repay bond investors. And missing a bond payment would constitute a default and would have severe negative consequences on the town's bond rating and access to capital markets in the future. And then finally, and perhaps even most importantly, would be loss of flexibility. So, this would apply really in two areas. The first being the loss of a budgetary flexibility, because as Attorney Ritter said earlier, state statute requires the town to fully fund that ADEC payment once they've issued pension obligation bonds. So that is an additional fixed cost in your budget. That on top of the fixed cost for the bond payment. Further, issuing pension obligation bonds would, depending upon the size of the issuance, could crowd out the ability to issue future debt finance projects. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight a few other specific concerns that are relative to the town, and then talk about what I think are some real positive, mitigating factors here, some of which you've heard about already. I think in dealing with the rating agencies, the concerns that they're going to have specific to West Hartford are going to be really a loss of budgetary flexibility, and the current pandemic environment plays into this. Because the credit rating agencies do have a concern about the longer term impacts of COVID on revenue at both the local and state level. And as we know that the state does have its own pension concerns, and the town does receive, roughly 13-14% of its budget in the form of state aid. If the state were to have its own budgetary problems and pressures and looked or sought to reduce aid to municipalities in upcoming budget years, that would just be an additional pressure on the town's budget at a time where it's increased its fixed cost. Additionally, the town's current debt position whereas is manageable as it relates to direct debt of the town, but the town is subject to overlapping debt from the MDC, which we're all aware is going through a rather robust capital improvement program. And so that does factor into the credit rating agency's calculations. And so given the overlapping debt from the MDC, the town would be at the higher end of their peer group for as it relates to debt. And then, the one thing that's maybe a little more controversial here is some of the town's underlying credit fundamentals are weaker than the relative peer group in the state of Connecticut. And again, the credit rating agencies, for fairly or unfairly, are going to compare the town to what they consider its peers, and that's going to mainly be Fairfield County communities who, when we look at certain wealth metrics, are going to be, in excess of the town's position. However, I do feel that there are a number of positive, mitigating factors or credit factors here that we're going to discuss with the credit rating agencies and highlight to show that the town is different than most of the other issuers who have undertaken pension bonds in the state of Connecticut. So first and foremost, Pete mentioned earlier that the town's excellent credit rating. That's really a function and representative of the strong financial management of the town. And a few examples of that as it relates to pension, the town is consistently funded at its actuarial determined contribution annually. And that's despite, as Pete said, an increasing contribution that's really been driven by the town's conservative approach to the internal rate of return or discount rate of within the plan. So as that discount rate has been lowered to match market market outcomes, it's caused the ADEC to go up, and the town is consistently funded at that level. Additionally, the town has taken a number of steps to constrain the benefits through collective bargaining process, including bargaining increase employee contributions, as well as developing a hybrid plan. Things that we refer to as addressing the liability on the back end to really show that the town is doing all that it can to address this one area of credit weakness. But I think most importantly, the single strongest factor we have here is the creation of this pension reserve or stabilization fund. As has been said earlier, this is a real very unique element that has not been taken to this level by prior issuers in the state of Connecticut. And I think what it really does is it separates the town from those other issuers of pension bonds and really demonstrates the type of fiscal discipline and planning and strong consideration that the town that's led to the town's lofty credit ratings. And so I think this is going to be well received by the credit rating agencies. I think it'll be well received by the capital markets when we go to sell the bonds. And I do echo Attorney Ritter's comments that it's a really strong element to this transaction. That's all I have for tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Lindsay. Appreciate it. Okay, back to you, Mr. Privatera.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to turn it over to Becky Seelman, our consulting actuary, who's going to walk us through the process with respect to how we came to this determination on the issuance of bonds and how we're going to protect the town with the reserve. Thank you. To you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Privatera, and over to you, Becky.
Thank you so much. I'm Becky Seelman. I'm an actuary with Milliman. We are the actuary for the town, both for its pension plan and for its other post-employment benefits. And the town has asked us to do some robust analysis around the potential long-range financial impact of issuing pension obligation bonds relative to what if the town does not do so. So if you would please advance to the next slide, I will walk you through some of our calculations and analysis. First, I wanted, in some instances, repeat what you've already heard, but I want to make sure you have all of the facts in one place. We are proposing that the amount of debt is sufficient to bring the plan to about 100% funded as of next July 1st. Now, of course, we don't know what the investment performance will be between now and then, so this is an approximation of where we believe the plan may be by next July 1st, using an interest rate assumption of 6.25%. That is more conservative than the 6.99% interest rate assumption that we've used with the July 1st, 2020 valuation. So it is a more conservative basis for measuring the plan's liability, and therefore a more conservative basis for evaluating how much debt would be needed to make the plan fully funded. The plan is to issue the debt in the late spring, before June 30th, and the proceeds of the pension obligation bond will get deposited right away into the pension trust, but held in cash or short-term investments. And the pension board will be involved in a plan to gradually trickle those obligation bond proceeds into full investment in the target allocation over a considerable period of time, to make sure that we're not taking the risk of investing all the funds at once immediately before a market downturn. So we may, this conservative approach may potentially mean that the obligation bond proceeds don't earn quite as much investment income as they could, but we're trying to be as protective as possible and avoid the deleterious impact of a market downturn. A lot has already been said about the reserve fund. We have already determined, based on the July 1st, 2020 valuation, the amount of the town's actuarially determined contribution for fiscal year 21-22, and it's $26.9 million. If in June you deposit hundreds of millions of dollars of pension obligation bond proceeds, you don't also need to contribute $26.9 million to the pension fund. That would be a little bit of overkill. So instead, that $26.9 million will be diverted, if you will, into a reserve fund. And the reserve fund will be invested very conservatively. It is a hedge against future investment volatility and what that might do to future town contributions. And as with any hedge, it comes at a cost, and the cost is you're going to invest it in very low, safe investments and not take investment risk. In any year, if the actuarially determined contribution spikes because of market conditions by more than 5%, you will be able to draw on the reserve fund to pay the contribution increase in excess of 5%. So just to illustrate, suppose it's a modest year, the contribution increases by 4%, the budgeted contribution from the town will therefore increase by the full 4%. But should there be a significant market downturn and the contribution would increase by, for instance, 6%, the town's budgeted contribution would only go up by 5%, and the amount of contribution in excess of 5% would be picked up by the reserve fund. So the reserve fund will take the tops off of peaks, spikes in the contribution, and thereby shield the town on a budgetary side from significant year-over-year increases. Another aspect by which we are being cautious in approaching the future is building in a policy to continue to fund the normal cost component of the contribution each year, so long as the plan is overfunded to a modest degree. And we've picked a 150-point threshold. So long as the funded status is up to 150%, the town will contribute the normal cost component of the contribution, even though there is a surplus that might, by other communities, be used to offset the normal cost. It's only if the funded ratio were in excess of 150% that the town might consider taking a contribution holiday and using some of that excess surplus, if you will, to cover the normal cost component of the contribution. This is an extra element of conservatism. So we've built in conservatism in how the pension obligation bonds proceeds are invested, not right away, but gradually. We've built in conservatism through the reserve fund process and mechanism, and we've built in conservatism by having a policy that the normal costs will continue to get contributed even when the plan is modestly overfunded. If you could go to the next slide, please. And we've built in this conservatism because issuing a pension obligation bond in some ways increases the risks that the pension plan faces and therefore increases the risks that the town faces. There is a significant unfunded accrued liability right now. As Pete said earlier, the plan is about 40.6% funded as of July 1st, 2020. But the obligation of the town to fully fund the unfunded accrued liability over time is not a mandatory act. It is a voluntary act on the part of the town. It is one the town has done for a very long history, but it is a soft obligation to pay off the unfunded accrued liability. There is no statutory or other requirement for you to do so. Whereas, as Bill pointed out, the pension obligation bond is hard debt. If you don't pay debt service, you'll be in default. So you've traded a soft debt for a hard debt. You've also taken on hundreds of millions of new money in the pension trust in order to make it fully funded. And more invested assets means you have more money in the market, but subject to market fluctuation and potentially market downturns. Over the long term, as Pete alluded to before, in theory, borrowing at a low interest rate, such as something in the neighborhood of 3%, and then investing it so that in the long term you ought to earn about 6.25%, in theory, the town will come out ahead, but there is risk. There is a possibility that the town will in fact end up paying more in debt service and pension contributions with the pension obligation bond than it would without the pension obligation bond, because there is a risk that there will be adverse experience, there will be adverse market conditions. At the most extreme illustration is if immediately following the investment of the pension obligation bond proceeds, there was a very significant market downturn and a lot of those investments were lost. The town would be facing needing to make pension contributions on top of needing to make debt service. Go on to the next slide, please. So we wanted to make sure that the town was fully informed about the magnitude of that risk. And in order to do that, we built a stochastic model. Stochastic is a fancy mathematical term. Many of you may have heard Monte Carlo as another word for the same thing. We constructed 10,000 hypothetical 30-year futures. Each one's different. They're randomly generated. They are an attempt to convey the possible range of investment performance over the next 30 years. The next 30 years, none of us know what that will look like. If there's one thing we know about the future, it's that we don't know what the future will hold. Will the future actually look like one of these 10,000 scenarios? It's very unlikely, but what actually happens over the next 30 years is likely to fall within the range of our 10,000 scenarios. For every one of those scenarios, we evaluated how well or poorly funded the pension plan would be in each of the next 30 years and what the town's contribution would be, both with a pension obligation bond and without a pension obligation bond. so that we could see the range of possible outcomes. And then we took all 10,000 scenarios and ordered them from top to bottom, from most favorable to least favorable, and we've presented them for you graphically so that you can see the full range of possible outcomes and use that as the basis for making your decision about whether to proceed or not. If you could go to the next slide, please. And this is the outcome of this analysis. And we raised 3 questions that we wanted the stochastic analysis to answer. The first is, what's the overall cost to the town over the life of the bond? That's over the next 25 years, both with and without a pension obligation bond. And that's what the leftmost series of graphs show you. You can see that we have on the left-hand side with the pension obligation bond, and on the right without a pension obligation bond. And let me just walk you through the colored bars. We've sorted the 10,000 scenarios into percentiles. And let me just start at the top, at the 95th percentile. 95% of the outcomes are at the 95th percentile or lower. So that represents all but the top 5% possible outcomes. In this case, we're looking at costs. So top is a bad number. It's a high cost to the town. We're looking at the net present value, the value today of the town's costs over the next 30 years, including both contributions to the pension plan and debt service. We're taking into account the reserve fund mechanism. So the 95th percentile does not include the 5% of the absolutely worst scenarios, but it does include everything else. Down at the bottom in blue, at the 5th percentile, that's the bottom 5% of the outcomes are that number or lower. And then finally, the median in black, that's the 50th percentile. Half of the scenarios have a better result, half the scenarios have a worse result. That's the, one might say, the average or the expected outcome is the median. That it is as likely as not that that will be the outcome over the next 30 years, with and without a pension obligation bond. So what you see from this picture is that with the pension obligation bond, the range of results, the distance from the 5th percentile to the 95th percentile is larger than without a pension obligation bond. That's a way of saying mathematically that the town has more risk, the more potential for really good things at the 5th percentile and really bad things at the 95th percentile. But the median is significantly lower. And that's a mathematical way of pointing to the arbitrage that Pete outlined, that you're borrowing money at a very low interest rate and investing it to potentially achieve greater returns. So the median net present value of the town's costs is lower by $120 million and change. The middle set of graphs answer a second question. The first set of graphs is what's the overall town cost. The second middle graphs are answering the question, what's the 1-year worst case scenario? How high might the town's cost be in any 1 year out of the next 30? And here similarly, high answer, those high numbers, the 95th percentile, are really bad outcomes. There is the 95th percentile says there's a 5% chance that the town's cost could be $97 million or higher under very adverse multi-year market conditions. With a pension obligation bond, that the 5% worst outcomes are at 97 million. But note that with no pension obligation bond, those same awful market conditions could boost the town's cost as high as $88 million in any 1 year. And note also that at the bottom, at the 5th percentile, the very best 5% of the scenarios result in a very low, highest 1-year town cost. And the median is also significantly lower with the pension obligation bond than without. And then finally, on the right-hand side, our third question is, how well funded is the plan likely to be 30 years from now with a pension obligation bond? So we're looking at what is the funded ratio in the year 2049. And you can see with the pension obligation, now here, funded ratio, a high number is good. So the 95th percentile here represents the best possible outcomes. There is a possibility that issuing those pension obligation bonds and then having a pretty darn good next 30 years, the plan could get wildly overfunded at 348%. Whereas without the pension obligation bond, although it is possible for the plan to get overfunded at 161%, the likelihood that the pension plan would get substantially overfunded is much, much lower without the pension obligation bond. And that's because you're starting now at 40.6%. So you have a lot of ways to go before you get to 100%, let alone 300% funded. But you'll see here too, the median result with the pension obligation bond is more favorable than without the pension obligation bond. So for all three of these questions, the answer that the stochastic analysis gives us is that the median outcome, the expected outcome, is better with the pension obligation bond than without, but the range of outcomes, the risk that the town takes on, is somewhat greater with the pension obligation bond than without. And that's the balance for you to be comfortable with, that the expected outcome, the expected beneficial outcome, outweighs the potential risk that the obligation bond represents. Could you go to the next slide, please? Now, we used this same stochastic mechanism to actually go through a whole host of other analyses, which I'm not showing you tonight, but we looked at all of the different elements of this package and played around with inputs to the model to see how changing, for instance, the length of the bond term. We looked at 20 years, 25 years. The interest rate on the bond, could we borrow at 3? What if we borrowed at 4? What if we borrowed at 3.5? To see how each of these elements, how moving each of these elements around might impact the results of the stochastic analysis. And running all of these different variations on this theme, we came up with the specific package that we're presenting to you tonight to bond enough to become fully funded, to borrow over a 25-year term. The analysis I've showed you assumes that the borrowing rate is 3%, that you put 100% of next year's contribution into the reserve fund and invest it in short-term cash equivalents, that the trigger for using the reserve fund is based on a 5% year-over-year contribution, and that you will continue to contribute the normal cost even when the plan gets modestly overfunded up to a 150% threshold. Could you advance to the next slide, please? There's a lot of small writing here. I'm required to tell you about everything that we've done to give you a full understanding of what went into our analysis. I'm not going to read this for you, but it's important for you to understand and be fully informed about the inputs to our calculations, the limitations of our analysis. Madam Mayor, I don't know if you want me to pause so everyone actually can read this or leave this as an exercise for the reader later. There is a second slide with a lot more small print as well.
I think people can read that at their leisure. We have this board docs on and we did get an email as well. So I think that's fine. So.
Okay, I would just, I do want the record to show that should any of our analysis be released, that it must be released in its entirety, including these 2 pages with the small print. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Yeoman. It was really helpful. All right, so now we will go I think we should open up to any questions from, unless, well, why don't, Mr. Hart, why don't I go back to Mr. Privatera? I'll start with you, and then Mr. Hart, and then we'll open up for a couple questions. Mr. Privatera, a couple comments, and then over to you, Mr. Hart.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Pete Privatera, Director of Finance. I think that all of the relevant points that we wanted to make tonight were covered. I think that we've put a lot of thought into this and a lot of analysis. And I think the concept of the reserve fund, again, is there to protect us in times of economic downturn. As I stated earlier, we certainly can do the same thing that we're doing now, but if I were a betting man, I'd say 10 years from now, we'd probably be still under 50% funded. You know, it's important that we address this liability as soon as we can. And I want to thank the council for the opportunity to have this presentation. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Privatera. Mr. Hart?
Thank you, Mayor. Matt Hart, Town Manager. I'd like to thank the members of the team for a very thorough presentation this evening. You know, we look forward to your questions. I am really, in making this making this recommendation, I understand how significant it is. I am, I think, motivated quite significantly by some of the points Peter made. You know, the town has been doing everything right for the last decade or more in an effort to turn the ship around and get the plan more fully funded. And despite everything we've been doing, we've been making very, very slow progress in that regard. You know, that in and of itself doesn't warrant taking significant risks. And I think the steps that we've taken here, establishing the reserve fund, the fact that we are otherwise in a strong financial position, that we have this historic opportunity with these low interest rates, make this recommendation more viable at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. So I want to open up to any questions. So we all had some opportunities to ask in sort of an individual sort of tutorial, because this is a really complicated subject matter and can be misconstrued. And I think what this team has done, and I appreciate all of the work that you have done and brought to us. And I think the presentation was really effective and good. You know, it's complete. And if it was easy, we would have done this a long time ago. So, but I do think we have a very unique window with interest rates as low as they are. But there's no question there are risks. But I have a couple of questions, and then I will go to my colleagues. And maybe this is for Becky. When we talked about, actually, this might be for Chris too, I'm not sure. When we talked about the investment over time, that was for the full pension obligation bond, I think, Becky, is that correct? Was that the assumption?
This is Becky Seelman.
Yes.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. So that would be sort of a dollar cost averaging strategy, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. And now to Chris, is that, so would you also advise that be the strategy that is used to spread that risk over a year and a half-ish or something like that? Would that be your?
That's correct, Madam Mayor. In an extended period of time, but something akin to probably 6 quarters to get them fully to work and up and running in the pension plan to the ultimate allocation.
Thank you. And then in the meantime, it would be invested in a fairly low risk investment, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I do have a question on the initial reserve amount. We had referred to the 26.9. I think that was in a couple of the slides. And the current normal cost, I think, was 5.5. It was my understanding that the initial, it was just the past service cost that was that we would be able to reserve, and not the normal cost. It was 26.9 and 5.5. Peter, I think it was in your portion of the slide presentation, the PowerPoint. I said it was, what did I say it was on? It was on, I'm not sure exactly. So the point is the 26.9, I have it here actually. It's in, what is the planned current financial picture slide? The
The 20,
21, 22, right, where it was 26.9, and the blue, the normal cost was 5.5. Go ahead, Mr. Privatera.
I'm sorry, the, Peter Privatera, Director of Finance. The 26.9, is the annual required contribution that we would need to make next fiscal year, if we kept the discount rate at 6.99%, but then fully phased in the mortality tables that we started in the current year. Originally, when we talked about how we were going to fund the reserve fund, Becky had run a model with a 6.25% discount rate across the board for every year. That drove up the annual contribution to millions of dollars higher. And I said to her, I said, you know, we're facing a tough fiscal year next year. I'd like to keep it as flat as possible, you know, with the understanding that we are going to put that amount into the reserve fund. And I asked her to recalculate the reserve fund with the 26.9 and let me know how that affected the various scenarios out of the 10,000 scenarios. And that was done. And then they came back to me and said, it has a minor effect on it, but our intent was always to deposit the entire ADEC amount into the reserve fund. Again, if we reduced the amount that we put into the reserve fund, I'm sure that once that was loaded into the model and the model ran again, that would increase the probability from 2% to a greater amount that we would run out of funds because there would be less funds in the reserve fund. So that's how we came to that amount, that 26.9 million.
Okay, that makes more sense. Okay, thank you very much. And then the last question that I had, and I think I did ask the town manager this before, could be subject to a referendum, correct?
Yes, and it could be subject to a referendum if the resolution was submitted for the June 12th meeting. I believe the council would have to establish a public hearing, 30 days, I believe, and then at the end of the public hearing, it would come back to the council for action. I just wanted to clarify one point, and it involves the powers and the authority of the pension board. Once that money is deposited into the pension fund, we certainly would work very closely with the pension board. I'm on the pension board, as you know, and make sure that the investments were in line with a very conservative approach. And Chris and I, we discuss this all the time, and we would sit down with the chair, Nancy Dean, and the rest of the pension board, and would explain how we want to, at the initial period, would have to be a very conservative investment approach to this money because we wouldn't want to get hit with an economic downturn and have this turn into some sort of chaotic situation. So, but I just wanted to alert the council that the pension board does have the authority to invest the funds, but we would be working very, very closely with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Privatera. Okay, I do want to get to any other questions from my colleagues here. So if you have a question, actually, I think I'll go through alphabetical order. It just seems to be the easiest way to do that. So sorry, first and last, it's always hard. But Ms. Blanks, do you have any questions? And don't worry if you don't, and if you don't yet, and you have questions as you process all of this, that is what staff, I'm sure, will be more than happy to get your answers. So Ms. Blanks.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Mayor, Councilor Carol Anderson Blanks. Pete, my question is sort of piggyback off of what you just said in terms of the pension board being able to manage this. How often does the board meet, just for my own information? And can you just elaborate a little more when you say closely? What does that actually mean, especially for somebody who's not familiar with what they do and how they manage and monitor?
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mr. Privateer. Yeah.
Sorry, Madam Mayor. Through you, Pete Privateer, Finance Director. I believe we meet 6 times a year, but we do receive reports from our pension investment advisor, Chris Cashmere, on a quarterly basis as to how the pension fund is doing. We do have an established mandate on how the asset allocation is to be divided, but this is a little unique because, as we discussed, we don't want to take the full amount and put it into 65% equities, let's say. We want to basically manage the introduction of that amount gradually into the asset mix, because we want to make sure that if there is any hint of an economic downturn in the near future, we don't want to lose any of that investment. So when I'm saying work very closely with the pension board, that would be with the chair, with Chris Cashmere as our advisor, and with the remaining members of the pension board. And I know that the mayor and Councilor Gold are attendees at the pension board meetings as well. So I'm sure there would be a very robust discussion about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Privateer. Anything further, Ms. Blanks?
Thank you. I'm all set for now.
Thank you. Mr. Davidoff?
I have 2 different questions. The first is Mr. Privateer mentioned June 12th. I don't know if he meant January 12th. And then since Mr. Ritter's on the
Mr. Davidoff, we're having a very hard time. You're breaking up quite a bit. Is everybody, Mr. Privateer, are you having a hard time understanding?
Yes, I'm sorry, Madam Mayor. I couldn't understand the question.
Okay, so could you text it? Do you mind, Mr. Davidoff? Or you can call in? No. We can hear you, but it's break. We can hear your voice, but we can't understand your words. I feel like I'm a mother. We can't. So
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I believe if the question was, I'm sorry, Madam Mayor, if the question was related to the pension board meeting, that would be in January, this January. So if we were to take this to the pension, if this were to go to council, council would meet to take action on it, but the pension board is also meeting in January, and a similar presentation will be provided to them as well, if that was the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Mr. Davidoff?
I have one question, guys.
Cannot understand. I'm sorry. Could you text the town manager and we can get your questions answered through him, if that's okay. We can try you again. I don't know if there's any adjustments you can make on your end, but it's really hard to understand. So we'll go to Councilor Fay.
Thank you, Mayor Cantor, through you, Councilor Mary Fay. Gosh, you guys did a really great job of covering, in my mind, very heady stuff. It's very complicated. I've been overseeing pension and healthcare businesses and annuities and life insurance and stochastic modeling for a long time, and some of that flew over my head. But anyway, so you really covered, in my mind, really well the asset side. So we didn't really talk about too much on the liability side. So what about with, I guess this is for the Becky, the actuary. What about, life longevity increasing and morbidity, decreasing? And how does that extend the obligations? That's one question. And then just a couple of observations that I had. 6.25 of earnings is probably optimistic. I know you guys have taken that down, and I'll have to kick the tires a little bit more on the assumptions. But just kind of check my logic here. It seems like for people who don't understand this, it is really heady stuff. It truly is. If you have a house that's worth $500,000 and you have a 4% mortgage for 10 years, just trying to be simple, and if you refinance the 500,000, excuse me, my eyesight's so bad here, at 6%, now you have to repay over, or you do it lower for 6% to 4%. So you're at a higher rate. So aren't you kind of you're trading the upfront cost of the liability, but over time, and the extension of the liability to longer term, aren't you paying more over the long term, and you've got to cover that fixed cost? That's just sort of an observation that I think it puts us at risk for the earning rate versus the arbitrage portion of it. I just worry about these things because we didn't really talk about any black swan scenarios. So we've had them happen, but you've seen a lot of retirement businesses and asset-backed securities go under because of what happened in 2008. Then with the tech bubble, we're probably coming up on something now. So what kind of risk can we undertake with a black swan scenario? So I know it's a lot of questions thrown at you, but those are kind of the risks that I'm trying to mitigate. I think you did an excellent job on presenting the data. You really did. And it's an awful lot of information to intake, but I'm just really worried about the big blips that we could possibly have, as well as making sure that we match the assets to the liabilities. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll start with you, Peter, and then we can, I think Becky actually probably should answer because of the stress test she did and what went into I always called it Monte Carlo, but that's okay. All right, so we'll start with you, Peter.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think when Becky discussed that one slide where she had the three different points of where the medium outcome was, I think she discussed the 5% scenario as the worst case scenario that could happen in only 5% of the time. And again, obviously we can't predict the future. We look at the median numbers, we look at the average numbers, but the real difference here is that the reserve fund is meant to mitigate that kind of fluctuation. Now, on the debt service side, we know we're going to have fixed payments of debt service. The debt service payment is going to be the same payment every year for 25 years. So we know we're not going to have any fluctuation on that. We're going to have the fluctuation probably on the actuarially determined contribution moving forward, but that should be a lower amount. So, with respect to the impact on the markets, it's not going to impact the debt service side. It'll impact the on the investment side. And again, it's hard to predict. And through you, Madam Mayor, I'll let Becky chime in with her comments on it. But I think that reserve fund will protect us for the most part. But Becky, through you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Privatera. Ms. Seelman.
This is Becky Seelman. Councillor Fay, I hope I've gotten your questions in order. You first asked about what about the liability side? What about longevity? As Pete alluded to earlier, these valuation results and all of this analysis do reflect adoption of the most recent up-to-date mortality table that's based specifically on experience for public pension plans. And we build in an assumption about future improvements in longevity as well. So we're not just looking at how long people live today. We're anticipating that in future generations, people will continue to live even longer. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't going to be some things that will change liability in the future in an unexpected way, and evaluating that those kinds of risks was beyond the scope of what you asked us to do. You also asked about not only are we changing the interest rate, but are you taking on additional costs because you're extending the term? And we've actually synced up the term for both the pension obligation bond and the period over which the unfunded accrued liability is financed, so that they have the same term. So we're not changing in your mortgage example, we're not lengthening. We're just changing the interest rate. And then you mentioned black swans. I stumbled by accident on one of the particular scenarios out of the 10,000 has 5 or 6 years in a row with negative investment returns, which to me seems so much more horrific than the term black swan. There's something a little pretty about a swan, even if it's black. But honestly, I the language needed to describe 5 years in a row with negative investment returns is not suitable for a public environment. So I will just leave it to you to imagine the widespread economic chaos that would result from 5 years in a row of negative investment returns on the pension assets. And that is one of the scenarios in the 10,000. So I feel confident that the 10,000 scenarios really do represent the widest possible range of potential outcomes over the next 30 years.
Thank you very much, Ms. Seelman. Anything further, Ms. Fay?
No, my only question would be is tail risk. So these are medians, right? So there's extremes on both end, more, favorably, of course, and then, unfavorably. So is tail risk built into these scenarios as well?
Thank you, Ms. Fay. Ms. Seelman?
That's why we wanted to show you the spectrum of results so that you could see the 5% worst outcomes and the 5% best outcomes, and not just focus on the median or expected outcome, so that you can judge for yourself what those tails look like.
Right, and comparing tail to tail is important. So, right.
Absolutely. Actually, my questions are more for the group, because this is, like I said, it's very heady stuff.
Yep.
And I only know so much because I've worked with it for so long, and I'm just trying to give perspective here. So it's challenging information to try to decipher. So, to make the right decision is why I'm driving towards these questions, not to, throw anybody off or anything. I think for the layperson, it took me a long time to build up this knowledge. And so Becky, thank you very, very much. You guys went through it, and I thought, like I said earlier, I thought it was very comprehensive, and you did an excellent job. But I just think those are some of the questions that probably others have. That I was just trying to distill it for the people listening in. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fay. I think, Mr. Hart, you have Mr. Davidoff's question. If you could go to you, and we'll try to get that answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Matt Hart, Town Manager. Deputy Mayor Davidoff asked if this item would be on the agenda for the council's January 12th meeting, and the answer is yes, if you have consensus to move forward. But then a more substantive question for Attorney Ritter. Matt, what should the council be looking for? What are some of the key elements of the bond ordinance and the proposed reserve fund policy? What are some of the things that the council should be mindful of and looking for?
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Attorney Ritter.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Getting that right this time. Sorry about that the first time. Good question. And Pete, certainly feel free to chime in. I mean, the bond ordinance itself actually is sort of very similar to a normal bond ordinance that we will draft for you. You'll make an appropriation of the total par amount that you're going to deposit into the pension fund, and then you'll authorize the issuance of pension obligation bonds to pay for that appropriation. It will have all the bells and whistles on continuing disclosure requirements. That was alluded to earlier. These are going to be issued on a taxable basis unless there's some change in federal law. They will be exempt from Connecticut taxes or income tax, but they'll be federally taxable. There's a couple things in the bond ordinance that are a little unique. One, sort of, we're trying to remember the language we mentioned that Bill Lindsay and I both talked about the appropriation guarantee of the annual ARC, the ADEC. That's built into that ordinance, so you don't have to do two of them. So you'll see that in there. And then we do talk about how the council will adopt a policy on the reserve fund. So those are two things that you would see unique to your normal bond ordinance. On the reserve fund, as was alluded to, I think, in Becky's slide, we talk about when can you use the reserve fund, right? And she mentioned this 5% annual increase. So that's what you'll see in there is, to the extent that it exceeds 5%, you can use the reserve fund, the $26 million, whatever's in there, to make up that increase above 5%. And then you would budget the normal process up until that 5% increase. We also had some interesting conversations about what do you do if the reserve fund is depleted and all the funds are allocated because you had, again, a couple tough years and you saw increases. So we'll talk about that. Again, this is all subject to discussion and have you. We talked about what happens if there's money left over 25 years from now, which could happen, right? If things go really, really well, you could have leftover funds. So we try to think about all the things that you'd have questions about. And Pete, I'll certainly defer to you, through you, Madam Mayor, if you have anything to add to that.
Thank you, Attorney Ritter. Mr. Privatera?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think the most important aspect of the reserve fund policy was, number one, to release funds when we need them if there's an economic downturn, if the ADEC is in excess of 5% on a year-to-year basis. Number two, to protect the reserve fund from use for other outside purposes. So I think we limit the use of the reserve funds to both an ADEC payment, and if certain situations exist, to use that money to pay debt service on the pension bonds only. And certain criteria were established in the reserve fund. Certain tests need to be met. And I think, at some point in time, if that money was to be used for a different purpose, I think we added that a pension valuation would be required to make a determination as to how that additional usage would affect the balance of the reserve, and how that would affect the balance of the bond term. So what we tried to do is put a lot of safeguards into that reserve fund that basically would discourage future councils from coming in and saying, you're funded at 100%. We're having a tough year. Let's take 10 million out of this fund and put it over here, which is in essence, how we got to where we are now in some respects. So the reserve fund policy is written. All the team members had their say in it. I made sure that Matt Ritter covered the legalities of it, and it's ready for your review. The bond authorization ordinance is written. It's complete. Matt completed it. So if this council wishes to move ahead with this, I certainly can get both of the documents to you tomorrow, or I can submit them, for action at the next council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Privatera. From what I understand, Leon's having some technical difficulties. He can always view this, but so I'm not going to ask if he has further questions. I'm going to move on, and if he has any, we'll go back. Okay, Attorney Gold, I was going to say. Councilor Gold. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and I can be an attorney too if you want me to be today. Through you, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm sure everybody is appreciative of the comprehensive work everybody's done on this, and the workshop was certainly enlightening as well. I just want to make sure I had some numbers correct here. So we're and maybe Peter can answer this through you, Madam Mayor. We're at about 40% funded. So the rate of return that we're looking at we have it at about 6.25%. We'd be borrowing 60%. On that 60%, we'd be funding another 60% that we borrow money and have a interest rate on. If it's at about 3.25%, then you're looking at a blended rate of about 7%. So it's not. I mean, you're looking for effectively a higher rate of return than 6.25% because you have to make up for the 60% that's in there. Is that math accurate, or am I missing something there?
Mr. Privatera?
Yeah, through you, Madam Mayor. We already are funded at 40%, so that money's already there. So we don't need to borrow that money.
Right. So you're only borrowing the 60%.
Right. And we're borrowing it. We assume we're going to borrow it at a 3% interest rate. Okay. So when Becky, and Becky, correct me if I'm wrong, when Becky calculated the value of what we would need to fund the liability and to sustain that fund, 6.25% was used. Now that 6.25% was based on discussions with our Chris Cashmere, the pension investment advisor. So we do not need to make a higher amount than the 6.25% to remain at 100% funded.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Privateer. Mr. Gold, do you understand?
I do understand that. I get that, but okay. So I guess if the return on the assets isn't greater or equal to the service cost plus the interest, then we're going to effectively fall into a hole. Is that
Well,
accurate?
actually, let me go to Becky. We can talk to, can you, I think, if you need clarification on the question, I'll go back to Mr. Gold, but.
Yeah, this is Becky Seelman. Mr. Gold, I'm not sure I'm exactly following your logic, but maybe I can restate it.
Okay, Mr. Gold, can you want to just, we'll try restating it. I'm sorry, I went too fast. Sorry, try restating it, Ms. Seelman.
Yes, Madam Mayor. If the investments always earn exactly 6.25% year in and year out, of course, we know that won't happen, but just the hypothetical. And if everyone always lives as long as expected and all of our assumptions about the future hold true, the plan will always remain 100% funded on the dot. Now, of course, we know that there will be fluctuations. And so there will be some years where the plan falls below 100% funded and the town will need to make larger contributions. And there will be years when the plan is over 150% funded and the town might take a contribution holiday. But there is not a necessity for the investments to perform greater than 6.25% in order for this to happen.
Okay, so and
Mr. Gold, wait. Okay, now, Mr. Gold, go ahead, Councilor Gold.
Madam Mayor, thank you, Becky, for that clarification. So the model that we were talking about, this stochastic model, really it talks about an end point. It's not, and as we're looking at, I think it was page 27 of the three categories and three questions we're talking about. Really, what ends up happening is the median level without as much risk, because when you're talking about arbitrage is riskless, if I'm not mistaken, but you're making a calculated bet to generate the median. And if you go to the far right categories that you presented us with, it's about the same median with less risk over time. Is that accurate?
Thank you, Mr. Gold. Ms. Seelman?
Yes, this is Becky Seelman. I think that we are using arbitrage, that term, in a very loose sense, not in its specific technical sense. So this is not a riskless arbitrage transaction. In fact, this is a transaction where the town, by having more invested pension assets, is taking on more investment risk in return for an expected reduction in the long-term cost, because of being able to borrow at a low rate and invest at a higher rate.
Thanks.
So,
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I think that was the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Seelman. Mr. Gold, anything further?
One last question, and I'm not sure who wants to answer that, but does this all further rely on the fact that employees don't change in terms of the amount of employees the town maintains based on these models?
Thank you, Mr. Gold. We will go to, actually, I'll go back to Ms. Seelman. I think you can answer that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, our assumption about the future is that employees, the size of the workforce, and their behavior is not impacted any way by issuing a pension obligation bond.
Thank you, Ms. Seelman. Anything further, Mr. Gold?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I'm all set. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Kerrigan?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Sweeney?
Thank you to the team for putting together this proposal. I know it's been a while since we were in a room together. I remember back at Town Hall, we first talked about this, but Becky, Councilor Ritter, Peter, I know this has been your baby for a little while, and working with the mayor and Matt, really appreciate it. It's really great to see our team working together in such a way to think innovatively and ways for us as a town to kind of deal with the shortcomings that I think all municipalities are going to be looking at for the next couple of years, and really, really appreciate the effort and the time that you guys put into this. So thank you guys, and it's really been, as everyone here has surmised, the presentation you gave on a very difficult issue was top notch, and we really, really appreciate this and the other breakout sessions that you guys lent yourself to. So really appreciate it, and I don't have any questions. I appreciate the work you guys put in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney. Ms. Winograd?
Thank you.
Still,
Yeah, no, I'm here. I couldn't find my cursor. Thank you again. Repeat what Liam said. Thank you very much and for the presentation, and to the extent that the public will have lots of questions about this. Hopefully, the more we ask our dumb questions, the better we're able to figure out how to it really express this to the public who's, and to people who aren't, haven't done this kind of thing before, which is most of us. And also, again, Liam's point, absolutely. Thank you for the individual sessions. I'm sure we all found those really valuable and necessary. I do have just one or two follow-ups from the conversation we had at the time. Part of the, everything is very clear, and you made it clear to the benefits and the sort of margins that we're looking at and the percentages. The one issue is, again, your test, the Monte Carlo, it's easier to remember and pronounce than the other word you use. But it is somewhat of a black box. We can trust the outcome, but it's very hard, for the layperson to see what went into it. And so I guess I have two questions. One, which I've already asked in private, which was, given that we are going to dollar cost average as we invest the money over time, did we test that out? And so are the numbers that we're looking at with that testing, or is it assuming that we put all the money on in day one, and then what impact would that have on it, and how much does that sort of moderate the risk?
Thank you, Mr. Winograd. Thank you. So would you want to add that to go to Ms. Seelman? Would that be?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll start there. Okay, Ms. Seelman, go ahead.
This is Becky Seelman. That's a very good question, Counselor. No, when we did the stochastic modeling, we did not take into account that gradual investment of the obligation bond proceeds. So all of the analysis you've seen this evening and in an earlier session was based on immediate full investing of all of the proceeds according to the pension plan's target asset allocation. We believe from first principles that it will be safer to gradually invest the money over a period of time than to invest it all at once. But we did not mathematically test that belief.
Thank you, Ms. Seelman. Mr. Winograd?
Thank you. And I guess that just does become a question in that I would have the same assumption, but I don't know whether or not, I don't have any way of knowing whether that would have an impact on the medians that show up elsewhere in terms of the expected benefit of doing it. And I just sort of raise that issue. I'm not sure what to do with that as what, but, and then just sort of related to that is just in terms of the methodology, and I assume it's proprietary, as to running the 10,000 scenario. I assume it's not just random numbers. You're not, getting negative 400 in one scenario and 8,000 inflation in the other. You've got some range. Is it a random selection, or is it somehow thought to be within the realm of possibility based on 100 years of investment experience? How do we get those numbers that aren't just mathematically random, which I assume
Thank
And I
you,
guess,
Mr.
and just
Winograd.
related to that would be, and we sort of went through this with the website 538 on polling, the fact that, are you doing individual, like is each year in the Monte Carlo a separate, somewhat randomized thing, or do you build in the fact that one year is going to relate to another? And that if the entire environment has changed, and you would get a lot of bad years or a lot of good years, depending on, some kind of big change in the environment.
Thank you, Mr. Winograd. Ms. Yeoman?
Thank you.
This is Becky Seelman. I suppose I would be happy to, if anybody would really like to see the gory details of the model, I'd be happy to walk you through it at that level. To answer your question about the various scenarios, both Mr. Kachmar and I have referred to capital market assumptions that each of our firms independently update on a frequent basis. Our two firms historically have marched pretty well together in terms of our independent expert long-term views about future investment returns for different asset classes. But the capital market assumptions include both an expected return for each asset class and a standard deviation measure of the riskiness of the asset class, and then the extent to which the performance of different asset classes are correlated with one another. And we use all three of those elements to look at expected returns for the portfolio as a whole, and to measure the extent to which the returns in any particular asset class might vary from one year to the next. The 10,000 scenarios are generated randomly, but subject to the constraints of the expected return and the expected standard deviation of each of the asset classes for each of the classes separately, and then we compile them into the expected return and volatility of the portfolio as a whole.
Okay.
That's the technical answer.
I get it. Took me.
Thank you, Mr.
Walk it
Winograd.
through, but I got it. Thank you very much.
All right. Anything further?
No, nothing further.
Okay. Mr. Williams, sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Appreciate it. Appreciate the presentation. Very thorough on a complicated issue. And I wish we were in person because it's hard on this forum, but you guys did a good job with that. So no particular questions. I think I'm just going to re-articulate some of the concerns I have with my colleagues. The first one is one Councilman Gold brought up, which is that the stochastic model does assume that the size of our employees moving forward is going to remain constant. I don't know how probable that is. I think that's something we need to think about, particularly on the public safety front, and whether that is something that we can rely on moving forward. Another one is a bond rating issue. I think we all recognize that if we go to the POB, there's going to be some eyebrows raised by Moody's or Standard & Poor's. And it's kind of interesting dynamic for me because on the one hand, a lot of what we've done to fund the pension in recent years and what we would do even if we didn't go to the POBs would be to maintain that rating. But if we go to this, to a POB model, we might put that into question. And it sort of is like, to me, that's one adverse outcome of shifting to a POB that's always been thought of as a risk of our pension situation, and it has caused us to put a lot of money towards our pension funding year to year. So I'm wondering why we're sort of taking that issue, I'm not saying lightly, but we're accepting that potential result on the POB front, where we've been less inclined to do so year to year in funding the pension. I'm also concerned about sort of a policy consideration of locking in the future councils to a fixed cost. Particularly, and this was discussed earlier, I believe by Bill, with some of the state and MDC funding issues that are down the road. I think that we're going to have some tough decisions to make, and I think we have to be cautious about trading a soft debt for a hard one, given that environment. Even if you think about some of the teacher pension funding issues that have been discussed about putting some of that on the municipalities, that's a concern moving forward. And the last concern I have is that switching to the POB model does not get us out of the pension framework for current and future employees. I know that's something we've talked about, Matt, in the past about switching to a strictly 401k model, and whether or not, if we were going to do something like go to the POBs, whether that's something we should be looking at as well. So those are just my thoughts, not questions. Want to add them to the discussion. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I mean, some of them were questions, or at least may require clarification. The first item that you had was the number of employees. I will defer to Becky on that, but I will say largely these are most of this is being driven by retirees and not by current employees. So go ahead, Becky.
This is Becky Seelman. We could certainly model the impact of some increasing or decreasing employee population. Note that would impact both the baseline with no POB as well as the scenarios with a POB. But I'm inclined to think, without having done any number crunching, that it wouldn't move the needle on either scenario all that much, because new employees do not come into the pension plan with any liability. They don't contribute to the unfunded accrued liability in any way, shape, or form when they're hired. The significant proportion of the liability itself is for those members who have already retired and are collecting monthly pension checks, and so are not impacted by future employment patterns.
Thank you, Becky. So, and then I think we go to Bill. Pay attention, Bill, on the bond rating. I think and maybe Mr. Williams, maybe you want to just clarify that, just that comment again, or the statement, or whatever that was. I'm sorry.
Sure. I mean, I guess before going to that, the thing, Seelman, I was referencing was on the chart you provided us, there was the fixed cost year to year for the POBs that locks us in for the balance that's owed for the past retirees. I think what I was talking about was that other number that fluctuates based upon current and future employees. I think, and that's what I was referencing. And I think that number on the chart, it's hard because no one has it in front of them, would fluctuate based on personnel decisions moving forward. Isn't that right?
The normal cost, Mr. Williams, the normal cost. Okay, Ms. Seelman?
Yes, this is Becky Seelman. You're correct, Counselor. The normal cost is the cost of benefits being earned by the current active employees, offset by what those employees are contributing towards the cost of their pension plan. So should the town's workforce increase in those unions that are covered by the pension plan, that would cause upward pressure on the normal cost component of the contribution.
And can I just, the normal cost contribution exists in the pension bond and without the pension bond. It doesn't matter, correct?
Correct. It's not impacted by how much assets the plan has. It's purely a function of the active members that are covered by the plan, the benefits they're receiving, the assumptions we're using to measure the value of the benefits they're receiving.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now over, do you want to, Mr. Williams, the bond rating? Was there, maybe you just go through, I don't know if there were comments or questions. I'm not sure. So,
well, I mean, there were comments, but I mean, my understanding is that if we switch to the POB model, that our AAA rating is put into question by at least one of the two entities, the agencies. So it just strikes me every year when we talk about funding the pension, we have always stood steadfast during my time on the council with meeting a certain threshold to ensure the AAA bonding rating. My understanding is, I guess now it's a question, is that if we switch to the POBs, it puts that AAA rating into question. And so why is that a worthwhile risk or outcome or potential with the POB model? And I know, Bill, you probably can't answer this, but it seems like that was not something that was preferable for this body year to year in terms of our funding levels.
So I can answer that. For me, why I'm seriously considering this as an option is that I'm seeing a median, a projected, because for 10 years, 20 years, our funding ratio has not changed, and we have an increasing every year, an ADEC that is increasing. We projected out our ADEC, we expect to go up another $8 million or so, or $10 million in the next 10 years, with the funding ratio remaining about the same. So this is it's been a very difficult budget challenge every year to keep increasing this contribution. We are not at a discount rate. We feel like it's probably the best reflection of the actual earnings. We're about maybe 3/4 of a point too high. And so every time we lower the discount rate, that money will go up. So it puts increasing pressure on our budget. I don't want to, I cherish our AAA bond rating. And I think the flexibility, the soft liability that we have, if we drop and we don't pay what the ADEC is on this increasing basis, we will be dropped out as a AAA bond rating. So I think our best strategy to preserving our AAA bond rating, and maybe it won't be from Moody's, but maybe it will be from Standard & Poor and Fitch, will be to decrease the pressures on our taxpayers by saving the tune of over $100 million over the next 25 years, and potentially more, 120 at the median, is well worth the potential downgrade. And I think it's a wrong downgrade. I think that is a very short-term look at a financial stability of a community. I think it's a narrow look. I shouldn't say that it's short-term. I think it's a narrow look at the short-term of the community. And I do think that we are incorporating mitigating factors that should reflect our financial commitment and our not flexibility, but our resilience that we have in that range. We have outside pressures no matter what happens. We're going to have MDC debt. We're going to have the state problems. We're going to have everything continue on our budget. But what I'm trying to do is stabilize our demand to meet our pension liabilities that have already accrued, not future liabilities. These are past liabilities that have already accrued, in the most favorable way for our taxpayers. And we have a unique window now to do that at a lower discount rate, a lower interest rate, in a way that I think makes sense at this unique opportunity. It didn't necessarily make sense when it was at 4.5%. But it makes sense now. And I don't know if we'll have this opportunity again. I do think if we don't do this, we are going to be, again, talking about $1 million, $2 million increase every year on this pension obligation. And future councils will say, I'm not going to do this. And you're going to lose your AAA bond rating. And you're still not going to stabilize and meet that obligation. You're going to actually dig yourself further into a hole. So that's my reason for supporting this. So anyway, but I don't know if you have anything further, Mr. Williams.
I mean, I appreciate the comments and feedback, and then that does play into, I think, the issue of outside pressures and what that looks like in the out years. So I guess that's just a discussion we'll have moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from counselors for the team or for town management? All right, I don't see any. I want to thank you all for being here, the team that presented. And also Bruce, I know you didn't present, but we appreciate your being here. And thank you all. We rely very heavily on the experts because this is a complicated, well, we rely on you all the time to advise us and to guide us. But this is an extraordinarily complex issue, and all those angles have really been, I think, addressed by this team. So I thank you very, very much. And you are welcome to sign off and enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you so much. And Mr. Privatera, thank you for a great presentation and answering all those questions as well. I'm sure more questions. I would say to counselors, if you have any questions that come up as you start to process or thoughts that you are, send them to Matt and Peter, and let's get them addressed. Okay. All right. Any closing remarks, Mr. Privatera, Mr. Hart? Raise your hand if you have any. Mr. Hart? Okay. All right. I've been encouraged very much to table the budget update to another date, to our next finance meeting. And I think our standing committee schedule can be done with so I without objection, I will table the budget update unless I hear otherwise from Okay, and new business, Mr. Hart, is the standing committee schedule. Do you want to make any comments on that? It's very, very brief, I think.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Matt Hart, Town Manager. And we'd like to see the standing committees begin meeting again in early 2021. Our understanding is that we'll need to continue to meet virtually through the winter and perhaps well into the spring. But Ms. Reinheimer from my office will be in touch with the committee chairs as well as the committee members to determine what schedule would work best. I have spoken with Ms. Evans from WHCI, and they are available for morning meetings as well, which is great news as long as there isn't a schedule conflict. So we'll be in touch with you soon to work out a schedule for the next calendar year.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hart. There are no announcements tonight except drive carefully and make sure you're prepared for the storm. Make sure that you have supplies and you can give yourself, stay home and stay off the roads. Actually, the only other thing I would say is headed into this holiday season, we are all very, very inspired and excited about these scientists and the rapid speed of this vaccine and the incredible research that had been done prior to allow this vaccine to come to our healthcare workers right now. But we have a very, a period of time that is really critical that we all still be very, very vigilant and careful. And so with that, I will say I want everybody to have a wonderful, happy, peaceful, healthy, and safe holiday and celebrate with I hope all your families are healthy and it's filled with lots of joy. And then I will, without objection, I move that we go into executive session pursuant to Section 1206D of the Connecticut General Statutes to discuss the selection of a site, lease, sale, or purchase of real estate and adjourn. And we will conclude the public portion of the meeting. We will not be taking any votes. This is for discussion only. So the public section of the town council meeting will be adjourned. Is there any objection to going into executive session or the adjournment? Seeing none, we will move into executive session. And from what I understand, you have a separate